How do you get some guarantee, I suppose, in urban design about the required social infrastructure? So, you know, people will buy into spaces, and it's always the question of which comes first. Do you get the buildings or the intensified buildings first, and then you can afford the social infrastructure that supports it? But it always seems that chicken egg. You can't pay for one until you've got the other, yet if you have the intensified housing without any of the support spaces, it just doesn't get done. And this seems to be an enormous challenge, even understanding at this stage what sort of social infrastructure we're going to need as different cultures try and cope with the intensified housing. Because in New Zealand, it's quite a significant change. You know, we've got, you know, perhaps in India, when you have intensification of housing, people have the cultural background to actually be used to that. But perhaps in New Zealand, we're not used to that, and therefore the significant change in lifestyle that is being brought about by this is perhaps more severe in New Zealand than anywhere else. So is there some other social infrastructure that's actually required, and can we cope with not doing it first?
Yeah, I think that's one of the difference between a lot of the projects that I touch on and the examples. It's the huge amount of public spending that takes place on these projects. Regeneration agencies, development agencies that are able to put in that social and public infrastructure, either initially or certainly to give everybody the commitment that that's going to happen. And again, that's one of the areas that we do struggle with here.
I remember when the guy from Melbourne Docklands was here a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen him. They set out all the streets in Docklands. That's just to the beside the CBD of Melbourne. And they set out all the streets, and they ran the trams through there empty for 2 years just to demonstrate that the trams were going to be there.
Shall we, oh sorry, I see you want to carry on. I was just going to interrupt and say thank you. We can probably carry on, interrupt, we can come back to Melbourne, because I think there's been quite a few issues surrounding that whole issue of urban choreography, you know, the idea that you must manipulate what happens and make some sacrifices in order to develop the kind of language of place. And I think Graham's probably going to pick up on some of those things. So I'd like to thank the panel who will return, and Alistair very much for their contribution. Thank you. And I'd like now to introduce Graham McIndoe, who will be known to many of you. He is an architect and urban designer. He chairs the technical advisory group on the Wellington waterfront. He's a member of the same group for the Wynyard Quarter here in Auckland. He's taught urban design at Victoria University and written numbers of publications, some of which were pictured in the previous talk, or at least ones he's contributed to. He's currently involved with many or numerous projects with Wellington City Council, including the Kilbirnie Town Centre. And today he's going to talk to us about how urban designers think. Thank you, Graham.
I ran into a long-term architectural colleague on the street just on Friday, and we were having a bit of a chat about this, and I said, I'm going to call the talk, how do urban designers think? And he started laughing and said, you mean urban designers do think? And that to me sort of validated this topic, because here was a person who's a director of a major architectural practice in Wellington, doing really nice work, and finding quite a few problems with taking things through processes. Perhaps somebody who didn't necessarily have an urban design background, but so I thought, well, this makes what I'm going to talk about worthwhile. Now, I know many of you, we could say anybody who is doing work in a city is involved in an urban design project, is involved in urban design. But certainly many of you would have taken projects through the urban design panel at Auckland City and have to consider urban design criteria. Of course, they're increasingly important in those consent processes which have been talked about already. But there are often frustrations. And I can say that working on both sides of the fence, because I work for private developer clients, trying to get projects through plan changes, resource consents and so on, but I also work for local authorities, writing design criteria, doing design review and so on. And I think there are differences in values. So I think there is a difference between an approach between architects and urban designers, even though all of you are in fact urban designers. And if that difference isn't recognised and understood, that can be frustrating for all concerned. Like, for example, the architects who are being knocked back with a project time after time after time. Now, what are these accursed urban designers on about? And likewise, it can be frustrating for local authority officers who keep on getting from a proportion of the projects coming through, projects which bear no relationship to their context, haven't thought about how things address the street, and they sort of almost despair. On the other hand, a significant majority of work is taking urban design into account, and that's really encouraging. So I'll aim to try and throw some light on the divide where that exists, and offer some thoughts on urban design which will, I hope, help you to negotiate your way through the complexities of urban design. Now, this is my own perspective, but it's informed by around 28 years in practice and 14 years of that teaching part-time at Vic. Now, I'm going to offer 9 thoughts, but before I do, I'd like to look at the concerns of urban design. Now, here are some ideas for the form and structure of towns and cities. Can you identify these? Well, obviously the one on the top left is obvious because Alistair has already talked about that. That's Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. But let's just ponder for a few moments. Do we recognise these? Okay. Now, I've helpfully provided the answers here. And we have, up on the left, we have got Garden City, obviously. Immediately below that, mid-left, Hampstead Garden Suburb, designed by Raymond Unwin, the first realisation, I guess, of the Garden City. And next to that, another image from the same project. Above that, in the middle, we have Radburn Planning, which was the American version of the Garden Suburb, 1928, Wright and Stein. Not Frank Lloyd Wright, Henry Wright. Over in the top right, I'm sure you all recognise Seaside, an example of new urbanism, the poster child of new urbanism. We have Milton Keynes below that, and then on the bottom right, we have Peter Calthorpe, and I guess some people say, well, classified as new urbanism, but also the ecological city. Then down the bottom, we have Frank Lloyd Wright, his Broadacre City. That was the dispersal of the city right over the countryside. There would be no city. And of course, Le Corbusier, his contemporary city in the middle, with extreme concentration in the very high towers in the middle of the green space at the centre of the city. Now, those bottom two, the last two, are seen as failures. Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City is almost what our cities are becoming with rural residential. Le Corbusier's single-use zoning has been problematic. Now, there's also a difference we can look at who has the power in making cities and what are the interests of different parties. Now, hopefully, I'll explain what's happening with those columns. We have the various parties involved across the top, developers on the left, and where I put a red dot, that means that party has power over a certain aspect of a city. A red circle, they have responsibility, either statutory or contractual. A black circle, they have an interest but no responsibility, and a little dash, no obvious interest. Now this is adapted from a diagram by Sue McGlynn from the Oxford Brookes course, an urban design course in the UK. She called it a powergram. I've added to it and for the New Zealand context. Now what we see is really that the power resides in the developer and in the local authority. Political decision makers are advised by the policy planners on such things as public space quality, as I can see there, land and building use, ecology, building bulk and form, and they set up district plans. The developers have pieces of land and they try to decide what to do with that. Now let's look over at the various designers. We see architects there. Now, architects typically deal with things, have responsibility for building bulk and form. They do not have the power to say that we can go as high as we like or as big as we like, because that is often controlled by the district plan, the political decision makers, concerned with building elevations and building detail and materials.